A royal figure is usually associated with cheering crowds, waving flags, and a presence that commands attention. But what happens when the cameras pull back and reveal absolutely no one? We've reached a point many believed would never come. Yet the recent events in Geneva have exposed a startling truth about the Meghan Markle brand. This was meant to be her grand stateswoman moment, a humanitarian address on the world stage, standing shoulder to shoulder with one of the most influential health officials on the planet. Instead, it became a lesson in public embarrassment, a moment so damaging that some are now calling it the collapse of the Sussex dream. As Meghan stood in an empty square speaking passionately to a handful of uninterested passers-by and a woman seemingly waiting for a bus, attention elsewhere was focused on something far more troubling. Because only hours before stepping up to lecture the public about shielding children from the dangers of social media, she had already showcased her own daughter in what critics saw as a merchandising display involving designer fashion inside a luxury walk-in closet. The contradiction here is almost suffocating. And today we're going to pull back the curtain on this carefully crafted performance and examine what may really have been happening behind the scenes of that lost screen speech. Let's set the scene, because Sussex PR teams appear to be working overtime to ensure the complete picture never reaches the public. Meghan arrived in Geneva with security arrangements you'd normally expect for a visiting world leader. There were black SUVs, controlled perimeters, and an unmistakable aura of importance surrounding the event. But when the moment came for her appearance at the Lost Screen Memorial, reality hit hard. Imagine standing in the center of a major international city, speaking through a microphone about something as serious as child safety, only to realize the only people nearby appear to be tourists trying to locate the closest Starbucks. Critics quickly pointed out how absent the crowds really were. In fact, the only individual caught in some shots appeared to be a local woman simply heading home after a long day. She didn't pause, she didn't glance over, she showed no interest at all. This is the same woman who, only a few years earlier, claimed she had become the most trolled person in the world and whose presence was portrayed as so impactful it allegedly threatened the very structure of the British monarchy. Yet, in Geneva, she seemed almost invisible. No Sussex supporters lined the streets, no signs, no energy, and certainly no warmth. The backdrop was painfully awkward, and it highlighted one undeniable reality. Public interest in the Duchess appears to have moved from fascination into something far colder, complete indifference. Even passing cars carried on without slowing down. For someone who depends heavily on public attention, silence on this scale can cut deeper than criticism ever could. And it raises an uncomfortable question for the Montecito camp. If you organize a global moment and nobody comes to witness it, do you still matter in today's world? But while the streets outside remained empty, Meghan's Instagram activity was telling a very different story. And this is where events shift from merely unfortunate into something many have described as far worse. Only hours before her speech discussing the measurable and preventable dangers social media can pose to children, Meghan uploaded what appeared to be a sweet mother-daughter moment. It was a mirror selfie taken inside a walk-in closet that resembled a luxury fashion showroom more than a family home. Clothing racks stretched across the room, with what observers estimated to be nearly $250,000 worth of fashion visible in a single image. And there, beside her mother, stood 4-year-old Lily. The post carried the caption, "Mama's Little Helper," and showed the young child watching her mother trying on outfits. But critics argued there was more beneath the surface, because this didn't feel like a spontaneous family snapshot. It looked carefully staged. The Armani dress, the dark shoes, the lilac coat, every detail seemed perfectly positioned for the camera. Lily wasn't simply participating in a family moment, critics argued. She had become part of a carefully crafted image strategy designed to soften perceptions before Meghan headed off to speak with grieving parents. Royal commentators have been brutal in their reaction, asking how such timing could appear so disconnected. You're preparing to stand beside one of the world's leading public health figures and discuss the ways social media exploits the vulnerabilities of children, while at the same time voluntarily presenting your own child to an audience of 4.5 million followers to help market clothing. For many observers, it was a staggering misstep that even supporters have struggled to justify. Because this wasn't viewed simply as a vain photo. Critics saw it as an unapologetic display of wealth and the use of a child who is far too young to consent to participating in a global branding exercise. And when Meghan finally stood before the microphone in Geneva, her words seemed to collide directly with her own actions from earlier that day. She spoke of a dangerous trade-off, where modern connection comes at the expense of childhood innocence. She warned that products today are designed to seize attention at any cost. But wasn't that exactly what the Mama's Little Helper post had done? A post carefully crafted to attract attention, while the price paid was Lily's privacy? Meghan told the audience, or more accurately, the three people standing nearby, that children should be protected by design rather than left to chance. Yet somehow, she appears to believe her own children operate under a completely different set of rules. And the contradictions didn't end there. She continued by warning the public about relentless algorithms and exploitative engagement systems, which becomes almost absurd once you realize that nearly her entire post-royal career has depended on exactly that. Every documentary, every interview, every conveniently leaked headline has been engineered to fuel the same engagement machine she now claims is damaging society. She spoke emotionally about parents grieving children lost to the dangers of the online world, weaving their pain into her own humanitarian narrative. But critics have been quick to point out one uncomfortable reality. If this issue truly mattered at the level she claims, would she really be showcasing her own children online whenever it serves a branding opportunity? She often describes herself as her children's greatest protector. Yet at the same time, critics argue she willingly places them before millions online because the validation and attention social media brings has become impossible to resist. It's that familiar Sussex formula, do what I say, not what I do. And then there's another question that naturally follows. Why exactly is the World Health Organization involved in any of this? The event itself was hosted by Dr. Tedros, a figure who has faced controversy of his own over the years. Political commentators have accused him of all kinds of things and questioned his credibility repeatedly. In that sense, some critics say he and Meghan almost form the perfect public relations partnership. Both are public figures whose reputations have faced serious challenges and who now appear eager to reclaim authority and trust. And the fact that Tedros may be one of the few major international figures willing to publicly lend credibility to Meghan arguably says more than anyone intended. But the most striking moment from this unusual partnership came when Tedros presented Meghan with a WHO field vest, and suddenly the comparisons became impossible to ignore. Because for many viewers, this felt like another attempt at Diana imagery. Meghan stood there wearing the vest, appearing to channel memories of her late mother-in-law walking through Angola's minefields. But there's one obvious difference. Diana was standing in active minefields. Meghan was standing on a quiet, nearly empty street in Geneva. Diana's efforts shifted global conversations and influenced policy. Meghan's critics argue her projects often seem more focused on improving engagement numbers online. The WHO described the vest as recognition of her commitment to promoting and protecting public health. But critics immediately ask the question, commitment based on what exactly? She hasn't built hospitals, she hasn't funded groundbreaking research, and many would argue she certainly hasn't improved public well-being through endless cycles of media campaigns and image management. The whole thing felt less like meaningful recognition and more like a staged gesture that unintentionally highlighted how far removed this now feels from genuine royal service. And if you pay close attention to footage of the speech itself, one moment near the end stands out. As Meghan reached the emotional peak of her remarks, speaking about how adults created digital spaces without proper safeguards, she repeatedly touched her nose. To some people, that may have looked completely ordinary, maybe just an itch, but longtime observers thought something else entirely. To them, it appeared as though she was attempting to trigger that famous single tear from the left eye image associated with earlier moments in interviews. It looked less like spontaneous emotion and more like someone trying to manufacture it, trying to convince the audience she was deeply affected by the issue. But many felt it simply didn't land. The long pauses, the trembling voice, the dramatic gestures. Everything felt carefully constructed, almost as if it had been designed for a future documentary no one may ever even watch. She described the Lost Screen Memorial not simply as a place of grief, but almost as a backdrop for a stateswoman audition. She spoke of kitchens once filled with laughter and shoes waiting by front doors, using vivid imagery of loss designed to reach people emotionally. But there was one problem. The audience she was trying to reach barely seemed to exist. Critics have called it manipulative, others called it exploitative. And for families who have truly experienced unimaginable loss, many believe watching their pain transformed into a stage prop crossed a line. Especially when only hours earlier, Meghan herself had been posting coordinated images involving her own daughter's clothing and appearance. For many observers, that contradiction simply became too much to ignore. And you may be wondering, doesn't someone around her point out how damaging all of this looks? According to royal insiders, apparently not. Reports have circulated for years suggesting Harry and Meghan are extraordinarily difficult to advise. Critics say they operate with the belief that they're always the smartest people in the room, and anyone offering criticism instantly becomes labeled toxic or part of the problem. And that mindset may explain how you end up with Exhibit A mirror selfie inside a $250,000 closet uploaded immediately before delivering a speech on online safety. It was the kind of public relations mistake a junior intern could have spotted instantly. But critics argue Meghan doesn't want interns offering caution. She wants people nodding along. People assuring her she looks like a global leader and an international icon, while standing in what increasingly resembles a ghost town. This constant ambulance-style mentality rushing from one crisis to the next while always positioning themselves as the victims seems to stem from a complete absence of accountability. They act however they want, whenever they want, and then appear genuinely surprised when the world responds with ridicule. Even journalist Tom Sykes, someone who has previously been fairly balanced in his coverage of them, has reportedly been brutal in his assessment of this latest trip. He noted that Geneva is a city associated with serious institutions and serious people. And the image of Meghan arriving to advocate for child safety, while simultaneously facing criticism over her own child's privacy concerns, has become a contradiction many no longer find amusing. And it's impossible to discuss the Geneva embarrassment without acknowledging what many call the Catherine effect. The timing of this visit appeared, to many observers, strategically placed against the enormous attention surrounding the Princess of Wales's recent tour of Italy. While Catherine was being praised as a true people's princess, displaying warmth, humility, and a natural connection to her causes, Meghan appeared focused on presenting herself as a major international figure. But sincerity isn't something you can perform. You either have it or you don't. And the contrast between these two women perhaps has never looked sharper. Catherine's crowds appear naturally drawn to her. Meghan's security barriers appear carefully arranged. Catherine's early childhood initiatives revolve around research, science, and long-term development. Meghan's critics argue that her efforts often seem centered around headlines, presentation, and image. When Harry once claimed that the royal institution viewed Meghan as a threat because of her ability to draw massive crowds, critics now say that reflected a fantasy rather than reality. Because those crowds weren't there simply for Meghan Markle, they were there for the Duchess of Sussex, and once the royal machinery was left behind, much of that attention appeared to disappear with it. Geneva became yet another uncomfortable reminder. The empty streets seemed to reveal something many had suspected all along, that the star power may never have belonged to her personally. It belonged to the crown. And after leaving the crown behind, the spotlight remained in London. Which brings us to what critics describe as perhaps the most troubling element of the Sussex approach, the role of Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet. Some observers now argue that Meghan's approach with her children resembles a psychological marketing tactic known as the curiosity gap. By withholding Lily's face while still featuring her within carefully curated content and designer settings, critics believe curiosity itself is being manufactured. The suggestion is that the children are being positioned as future reveals content, potentially reserved for major projects, documentaries, or high-value media moments. As Tom Sykes reportedly pointed out, a 4-year-old child simply cannot provide meaningful consent for having images shared with millions of strangers online. And this becomes especially striking because for years, Harry and Meghan themselves argued that paparazzi attention and online exposure represented serious risks to their children's safety. Yet critics ask an obvious question: who is placing them into that environment now? According to those critics, it isn't outside forces. It's happening from inside the family itself. Archie, now older, appears increasingly absent from public content, leading some to speculate that he may be reaching an age where he can express discomfort or reluctance about appearing in social media material. But Lily, at 4, does not have that same ability. And critics argue that she has instead become part of a carefully constructed image strategy, appearing in what they describe as vain and performative displays that contradict the values Meghan publicly promotes. To them, this increasingly resembles an experiment in digital branding rather than genuine family privacy, and only the most devoted supporters, critics argue, still view it as authentic. The Geneva speech itself was framed as a call to action. Meghan urged people to speak out, demand change, and set better examples. But critics immediately asked, how seriously can those words be taken if they aren't reflected in her own actions? She encourages the public to contact elected leaders, while critics joke she seems more occupied contacting designer labels for the next closet photo opportunity. She advocates transparency and accountability while continuing to operate through secrecy, image management, and highly controlled media appearances. The uncomfortable reality, according to critics, is that Meghan Markle may now be confronting something she never expected: irrelevance. A new generation of royals and public figures is stepping forward, and she is no longer commanding attention in the way she once did. People no longer seem to watch with admiration. Many now watch for the spectacle, for the crash factor, for that ambulance mentality, witnessing another public wreck unfold in real time. The engagement itself hasn't disappeared. It has simply changed. People aren't paying attention because they're inspired. Critics argue they're watching because they're waiting to see what contradiction comes next. And according to that perspective, the goal was never truly about improving the internet. The goal was improving the internet for Meghan Markle. Critics argue she wants an online world where uncomfortable questions disappear, where criticism is silenced, and where narratives remain tightly controlled. A world where difficult conversations vanish and only approved voices are allowed to speak. And ultimately, Geneva may end up being remembered for one thing above all else: the moment Sussex contradictions became impossible to ignore. Because critics argue you cannot stand before a memorial connected to lost children and speak about people placing profit above humanity while simultaneously facing accusations of putting image and branding ahead of your own child's privacy. You cannot deliver lectures on digital safety while also using social platforms to showcase luxury and excess. For many observers, it came across as an astonishingly tone-deaf performance, one that may have seriously damaged any remaining efforts to be viewed as a major humanitarian figure. And in the end, perhaps the most revealing verdict came not from headlines, commentators, or royal experts. It came from the empty streets, from the indifferent passersby, and from the woman standing at the bus stop. Because many now believe the public has stopped buying into the carefully crafted image of a politician in waiting. People believe they've seen through the Diana comparisons. And they've certainly stopped buying into the entire Mama's Little Helper narrative. Because if, as Meghan herself has claimed, even adults struggle to survive the bullying, hostility, and predatory nature of the online world, then an obvious question follows: why willingly place a 4-year-old child into the center of that same environment? Critics believe the answer is straightforward. Because for Meghan Markle, The brand appears to come first, ahead of almost everything else, including, some argue, the well-being of those closest to her. As the Geneva controversy begins to settle, what remains is a picture that many find both thought-provoking and deeply sad. Here is someone who once had what most people could only dream of: worldwide attention, an enormous platform, and an opportunity to create meaningful and lasting impact. But according to critics, instead of taking that path, she chose image, branding, merchandising, and a cycle of contradictions that never seems to end. During her speech, Meghan spoke about one day allowing our children to look back at this moment and feel proud of the choices we made. But many are now asking a different question. What will Archie and Lily think years from now if they look back and see their own childhood moments becoming part of media strategies and image campaigns? The Lost Screen Memorial centered around a serious and painful issue that deserved serious advocacy. Critics argue it did not deserve someone standing there in a lilac coat, while appearing more focused on visual presentation and image building than on the families whose experiences were supposedly being represented. Increasingly, many observers believe the public is beginning to reach a different conclusion about Meghan Markle. Not that she is a humanitarian figure who occasionally enters celebrity culture, but rather a celebrity figure who occasionally uses humanitarian causes to remain relevant. And as Geneva's empty streets seem to demonstrate, even public fascination may be beginning to wear thin. Critics argue the carefully constructed politician persona has reached its limit. They say the use of children in branding narratives needs to stop. And they believe there comes a point where demanding honesty and transparency from everyone else becomes difficult when your own public image appears built around contradiction. Because, in the eyes of critics, the Sussex dream didn't simply fade away, it became exposed. Exposed as something many now believe was always there beneath the surface. A carefully staged, highly calculated, and ultimately uncomfortable performance.